Hello and welcome to Just One More Watch. How many of you out there have thought about starting your own watch brand? I'm sure many of you have. If watches are a passion, then it's an obvious passion project, isn't it? Now, that can be as easy as picking a design from a catalogue, slapping your name on it and signing up for Kickstarter. We used to see that a lot, but thankfully not so much anymore. Or it can be a much more involved process, really as involved as you want it to be. Welcome today to my review of a watch that is one man's pursuit of perfection. That man is called Dillon and he lives about 10 minutes away from me in Sydney. We've spoken a couple of times over the last year or so about me reviewing his watch, the Mancheront, and initially I declined for reasons I will discuss later on. But we met a few months ago, had some lunch, a chat about watches, and after listening to his story and seeing his passion for his product, I couldn't say no a second time. He has personally sourced and selected every single element of this watch, right down to the packaging, including visiting the relevant factories with over 50, I will say it again, 50 factory visits to ensure he got exactly what he wanted. Now you saw the pop-up. This video is sponsored by Mancheront. There are 3 watches in the range, 3 different colour versions. I get to keep the black dial version on my wrist after the review. But this is a review, it's not an advert for Dillon. There's a moans and niggle section that I would advise you to stick around for. Let's flip the camera and have a look at it. Alright, let's start as we usually do with the packaging, because I think the packaging is kind of a case in point here. Dillon is an architect by trade, so his attention to detail is perhaps unsurprising, and he's now 7 years into this project, so I guess a certain level of refinement and polish is also unsurprising. But just look at how much thought has gone into the packaging. Mancheront branding on the outer box, the inner box and the flip down. There's a chunky brochure which we will come back to. The watch itself sits on a cushion, which is no great surprise, but underneath we find a high quality screwdriver for adjusting the bracelet, a branded polishing cloth and a warranty card that includes individual serial number, all rubber stamped by Dillon himself. He personally visited every single factory that makes every single component of this watch. That means over 7 years he's had trips to Switzerland, Taiwan, Bangkok, China and Hong Kong, all to make sure he got exactly what he wanted. In fact, this is a first. This is the first watch that I've reviewed that is assembled in Switzerland but not Swiss made, because it doesn't feature a Swiss movement, it features a Japanese automatic. Again, Dillon clearly decided that that was the rather unusual route that he wanted to take with this project. Now, I normally toss the instruction manual in the metaphorical bin, don't I? But just have a look at the detail that has gone into this. It's thick, it's full of pages. I don't think I've ever seen anything as comprehensive, certainly not from a one-man band with a one-watch brand. There are several pages, like 4 pages on how to adjust the bracelet. As I said, the attention to detail is next level. Very, very impressive. But you know, as I've said many times before, we don't buy these things for the packaging, do we? We buy them for the contents. So what then is the Mancheront Pacer? Well, I have no doubt this will look familiar to most people watching the video, more on that later. But this watch does have a combination of features and functions that I have never seen before on the same model. As you can clearly see here, there are 3 different versions of this one available: black dial, black ceramic bezel, black dial, steel bezel, white dial, steel bezel. I'm going to focus on the double black, but I will show you the others over the course of the video as well. Let's do dimensions then. A rather familiar 41mm in diameter, 14.1mm thick, which is a bit chunky. Lug to lug is 48, it's 20 between the lugs, tapering all the way down to 16. Sized up for my 7-inch wrist, it weighs in at precisely 154 grams. So this one nails the stainless steel sports watch sweet spot. As a sports watch, it needs a screw down crown and 100 meters of water resistance, which it has. It also has flat sapphire with anti-reflective undercoating and is powered by a rather unusual version of the Miyota 9000, the 9132. I say unusual, I've never seen this one before anyway. There's a date at 3 as per usual, but there's a power meter at 12, which is most certainly not usual, and a 24-hour register at the 6. Also unusual are the pulsometer gradings on the bezel, so it may look like a dive watch and you certainly can get it wet, but you won't be timing any dives with this one. Pulsometer bezels, if you've never seen one before, allow the user to take theirs or someone else's heart rate. They were popular as medics watches during the wars. I've maybe looked at half a dozen or so over the last half a dozen years or so, so they're certainly not common. This one is graded to 30 pulsations, so you count 30 heartbeats and then read where the second hand is on the bezel when you count 30. You can see it's only graded between 210 and 50. I guess if your patient has a heart rate in excess of 210, you're in a spot of bother, and if your heart rate is under 50, you're either an elite athlete or you're in a coma. Let's check out the case. It's a very unusual side profile on this one, an incredibly slim case, around 5mm, but a rather tall bezel combined to give it that 14mm of overall height. He calls this a wreath bezel, which I guess makes sense. It has those lovely whirlpool style slashes. It's a 120 click bi-directional bezel, by the way, to help you use that pulsometer more effectively. The crown is unsigned, but there's a concave indent which looks nice, so I'll kind of let it off. The brand doesn't really have a logo suitable for a crown anyway. The case back is really interesting. Those recessed petal-like shapes are actually there to help with sweat and therefore comfort. I don't think I've seen anything quite like it before, but it is rather pretty. I have definitely seen a bracelet like this before though. It is a straight up Submariner copy 3-link oyster style with screw links. The watch is supplied with half links, I guess because it features a butterfly clasp with security fold over rather than a more traditional diver's clasp. That means no micro adjustments but no bulk under the wrist. More on that later. We've already had a good look at the dial and hands, I guess, when we looked at that pulsometer bezel. Everything is just printed on here, nothing is applied. Simple baton indices for the hours, printed minute markers and printed fifth of a minute markers beyond that. This double black model is just all white on black. Perhaps not the most interesting colour scheme, but definitely simple and legible. It isn't all that obvious, but it's a sandwich dial. The power meter swoosh under the index at 12 is recessed. Very neat the way min sits above the swoosh, but max sits within the swoosh, if you see what I mean. I also like the minimal branding and the fact that he's incorporated the Mancheront name in the 24-hour sub-register. I guess the decision to use the 9132 forced the issue, but it's a much neater solution, I think, than sticking the name in the space at the 9 and leaving the dial somewhat off balance. Handset, very simple, white fence post hour and minute, needle second hand. There is some BGW9 on them, as I'll show you in just a second. As discussed, this isn't the only colour version available. You can have the same black and white dial but with a steel bezel, or the steel bezel with a white dial with black accents, the kind of negative of the black one. The white certainly adds something different. It doesn't look as familiar as the all black version. The half-half splits the difference. It's got decent lume, which is definitely something you'd expect from a sports watch. Superluminova on the hands and the indices, double index up at 12 and a small single down at 6, so you know which way the watch is aligned after dark, and after 20 minutes it's all still nicely legible, as I said, decent lume. On to the wrist shots before we get to the head shots. It's a slightly unusual profile looking down the wrist because the bezel is taller than the case. It's a little top heavier than other watches of this style that I've looked at in the past as a consequence, at least in part because there's no bracelet clasp to offset the weight of the watch head. It's a pretty nice wear overall though. It's got quite a lot of presence, especially with the light-catching black ceramic bezel insert of this version, coupled with the unusual bezel indents that are more obvious than they would be on a coin edge bezel or something similar, for example. Pocket shot to finish, 150 grams, no micro adjustment though, so you are going to be wearing this one loose. It's a pretty comfortable watch to wear on wrist, and you saw how smooth that case back is. That definitely is going to help you long term. Alright, moans and niggles, shall we start with the obvious one? Dillon has clearly poured his time, his money and his passion into this project over the last number of years now, to a level that I don't think I've seen with any other small brand. But despite all of this, I wouldn't necessarily describe the watch as original, and I'm sure you wouldn't either. When we met for lunch, we obviously talked a lot about watches, and I asked him what he had in his personal collection. To my surprise, he told me he only had one watch. Fair enough, no judgment there, everybody's different. Can you guess what that one watch is though? Surprise, surprise, it's a Rolex Submariner. And Dillon has spent a lot of time, a lot of money and a lot of effort making something that will remind 99% of the people who see it of a Rolex Submariner. Sure, there are of course differences, the clasp, the case back, the bezel, the dial, the handset, but that case profile and the 3-link oyster bracelet could not belong to any other watch, could they? That's why I initially politely declined the chance to review the Pacer, because on the surface it looks just like one more Submariner alike, and one that costs 1,050 Australian dollars, that's 700 USD, exactly at the current exchange rate. That's a fair chunk of coin for a Miyota 9000 series powered watch that has a very similar case profile to the Rolex Submariner. It's a fiercely contested price point. There are big brands that want your dollars, and there are more original micro brands that also want your dollars. This is undoubtedly very well made, very well presented, and has a unique combination of complications, but is there enough here to really grab people and make them buy it? And the clasp is very different for this style of watch. He could have been forgiven for going for a glide lock copy or something similar. Now, there are no micro adjustments, only half links, which means you're not going to get as good a fit. But the advantage is there's no bulk underneath the watch, so I guess there are pros and cons to that particular choice. But I guess the similarities to the sub can be spun as a positive as well as a negative. If you like the look and feel of a sub but not the price tag, and you want something other than just a one-for-one copy and paste lookalike, then the Mancheront does indeed offer something different. It might look like a Rolex from arm's length and from certain angles, but I've never seen a Rolex with a power meter and a pulsometer before. Perhaps it will find a few sales that way by being familiar but unfamiliar at the same time. So there you have it, about as far from a catalogue watch as you could hope to imagine, and yet still looking rather a lot like something else if we're all being honest. I really wish Dillon well with this though. I would love to see what he can do in the future, applying what he has already learned from the process of making his first watch, but to maybe something a little bit more unusual looking next time. It's hard to get your first watch right, but some people do it. Click here or click here for two of the best debut efforts I've ever seen. Thanks for watching this one. I'll see you again in a future video, I hope.